Yeah, I'd like to thank the whole UMBC research team for giving me a chance to come here today to present my research. And maybe my second book is on astroanthroecology. Never even thought about that till just now. So what I'm going to talk about today is very much what was just introduced here, the concept that the nature that we need to conserve in this human age is not a pristine, wild nature. The nature that we have today is a human cultural nature. And there's three things I hope that you leave here with by the time I'm done with my little talk. The first is that wilderness is a myth. The second is that nature actually needs people. And the third is that indigenous cultures are essential for sustaining biodiversity. So the classic way to look at the biosphere and the biodiversity of life is these natural patterns that you learn in kindergarten called the biomes. A good example, tropical rainforests, deserts, savannas. You're all familiar with these concepts, but as we know, we live on a planet that is increasingly transformed by human activity, right? We don't live on this planet that's completely wild anymore. We live in a human age, the Anthropocene. So these global patterns of biodiversity shaped by the long-term patterns of climate, the biomes, need to be thought of a little differently. And of course, we're seeing the transformation of, say, tropical rainforests into farms, agriculture, and other necessary types of land use to sustain human populations. But when we look a little deeper into the tropical rainforest, and this is an area of Amazonia that's been deforested, and what it reveals is a far deeper human history. This is a 900 or I think more than 700-year-old geoglyph. This is a cultural earthwork built by earlier societies that was covered by forest growth following the Great Dying after the arrival of Europeans and their diseases. So we have a much deeper and more permanent human history of biology and biodiversity and ecology that we need to think about. And so in 2008, together with Naveen Ramankutty, another geographer, we coined the concept of anthromes, or anthropogenic biomes. These are the global patterns of life that are shaped by human societies, like farms, etc. And I'll get into this in a little more detail, but what I really want to talk about, the exciting work that we did together with a dream team, really pulled together a dream team of archaeologists, paleoecologists, geographers, indigenous scholars, and conservation scientists to look at the deep history, the last 12,000 years of human transformation of the biosphere using this concept of anthromes. So let's take a look here at our results. So we looked at 12,000 years. We divided this into 60 time intervals. I think the most important thing to look at right now is that we have two ways to look at this global history. One is, of course, a global map. The other way is this chart at the bottom that's showing the global area occupied by different types of anthromes. And in this particular illustration, you're going to notice on the left is the legend there. And you can see at the top you have these intensive anthromes. These are like cities or intensive agriculture. At the very bottom you have wildlands. Okay, that's familiar. These are areas that have no evidence, at least in our data, of having human populations or land use. And then you have these cultured anthromes. And these are low-density populations in general and areas without so much intensive agriculture. And when you look at the planet 12,000 years ago in 10,000 BC, you are seeing a planet that is not mostly wildlands. That was a really amazing discovery for us, that when you do the backcasting modeling that we did to reconstruct the biosphere 12,000 years ago, if you look there, that brown color, you can see the cultured drylands there, that's really the dividing line between the wildlands and the anthropogenic part of the biosphere, the human-shaped biosphere. You can see it there, and you can see it's about three-quarters of the terrestrial biosphere has been shaped into these cultured anthromes 12,000 years ago. That's the end of the last ice age. Okay, so moving forward, 2,000 years ago, and you can see that, well, there's not any more wildlands, are there? There's even less wildlands over time, not surprising. And what you're also seeing is that you're seeing more of these intensive anthromes, these croplands and dense settlements and other kinds of anthromes are starting to become more common. 1500, right before the Europeans arrive on the American continent, and you can see, look at in Central America, I'm just going to highlight that. Look at Central America and look at that red color and the dark green and the yellow, those are densely populated, intensively managed parts of the planet, okay? Like the Mayan civilization. They're 1600 CE, boom. Thanks to the influx of colonial diseases, just colonial disaster in general, you can see that that's more or less been wiped out. And it takes a long time before we see that kind of intensive, high density kind of management in some of those areas again. Now getting closer to home, 100 years ago, 1900, you can see we're getting near half of the terrestrial biosphere is now intensively used. And again, no more wildlands than before. And then finally, just our most recent time, 2017, you can see about 3/4 is still, it's actually more, it's more like 80% of the terrestrial biosphere is in these intensively used and cultured biomes, these anthromes, and you can also see that most of it is intensively used at that time. So there's this relatively rapid, recent decades and centuries, relatively rapid, intensive transformation of the biosphere. I should also mention that when you look at this, about 90% of a place like a tropical rainforest is actually a transformed, cultured anthrome landscape. Now, when we look at just the parts of the biosphere, we're just focusing here on the areas that have been prioritized for conservation. Key biodiversity areas, indigenous lands, potential natural areas as classified by some of the conservation groups, we see about the same thing, about the same history. It's not like there are these areas of the world where people have not been shaping the landscape for thousands of years. This is common across just about everywhere, especially key biodiversity areas look very much like some of the most transformed areas of the world. This chart's a little bit confusing, a little complicated, but look at that gold color, okay, and look at where that is. It's not at the far end of the graph at the current time, okay? This is looking at how the patterns of the human-shaped world, these anthrome patterns of the world, how correlated they were, how well they predict the patterns of biodiversity on the planet. And what you see is the historical patterns predict biodiversity better than the current patterns. Maybe some of this early cultural shaping of landscapes actually may have produced some of this biodiversity. In fact, that sounds kind of shocking for a lot of people, but in fact, this is the common knowledge of archaeologists and paleoecologists who study these biodiverse places like Amazonia. There are thousands of years of history of hunter-gatherer and farming societies shaping more biodiverse landscapes through different kinds of low-intensity farming and traditional hunter-gatherer practices. So believe it or not, there's good ways of thinking about how it is even possible for this to be true. Now, it's very easy to just imagine a tropical rainforest, gigantic areas of, for example, Amazonia, as just these kind of wild natural places without people. But I think anybody who knows any more about this, goes to the ground and looks under those trees, you're going to see the people who have conserved and sustained and shaped the biodiversity of these places for thousands of years and are still protecting it now. Indigenous cultures protect, sustain, shape biodiversity. When we look at some of the most biodiverse landscapes of the planet, if we look at, for example, the Masai Mara, where people go to see these intact assemblages of megafauna that are rare everywhere on the planet, but in places like this. Well, this is not a wild place without any people. This is the traditional rangelands of the Maasai people, and they have cultured this biodiversity for hundreds of years, and also are protectors of this biodiversity. They are the solution, not the problem. Let's look at the deserts of Australia. Well, it took a while for people to figure this out, apparently, but in fact, the Martu people, for example, have been shaping biodiverse landscapes through fire, cultural use of small-scale fire that also prevents gigantic megafires like the ones they have in Australia now. They have been culturing this landscape for thousands of years. So when we think about biodiversity, we have to think about indigenous culture and the culturing of biodiversity. Indigenous cultures, even today, are widespread, especially in the places in the planet that are the most biodiverse today. So we need to think about cultural diversity as what sustains biodiversity. People are what sustain biodiversity. So we have to get beyond this kind of classic narrative of we have this wild planet with a balance of nature that is just being disturbed by people, and we have to get into the realities of this human planet where we really don't have this wild nature. We have a cultured nature, and the biodiversity we have has been shaped and entangled with human societies for thousands of years. And in this time of pandemic, when it's never been more clear to us how close we are to the rest of the biosphere, the world, the biological world is connected with us like never before, we need to really embrace this narrative for the biodiversity of the human world. Wilderness is just a myth, okay? Nature needs people, and indigenous cultures are what it takes to sustain biodiversity. Thank you.